This story is not about a fight that happened, but about one that never did. At a time when challenges followed Bruce Lee everywhere he went, when his name alone invited doubt, curiosity, and provocation. One particular challenge stood out not because of its intensity, but because of his response to it. People expected confrontation, proof, and a public display of dominance, believing that strength must always be demonstrated through action. What they witnessed instead was restraint, silence, and deliberate control. In that quiet decision, Bruce Lee revealed a deeper understanding of power, one that required no audience, no validation, and no physical demonstration to be complete. As Bruce Lee began to gain recognition, the world around him changed in subtle but important ways. His skill, speed, and way of thinking were no longer confined to private training spaces or small groups of students. Word spread quickly through martial arts communities, film studios, gyms, and social circles. People talked, compared stories, and formed opinions, often without ever meeting him. With growing recognition came growing pressure, and Bruce Lee found himself under constant observation. During this time, martial arts culture was deeply rooted in tradition. Many systems valued hierarchy, rigid structure, and loyalty to a single style. Bruce Lee challenged these ideas openly, not through disrespect, but through questioning and experimentation. He believed that effectiveness mattered more than labels, and that truth could not be confined to one method. This way of thinking made him stand out, but it also made him a target for criticism and doubt. As his reputation expanded, so did the number of people who felt the need to test him. Some were genuinely curious, wanting to understand how he trained or why his ideas worked. Others felt threatened by his growing influence and his refusal to conform. For them, challenging Bruce Lee was not about learning, but about protecting their own status or beliefs. In this environment, challenges became a way to settle unspoken tensions. It was common at the time for rising martial artists to be approached with demands to prove themselves. These challenges were not always formal or respectful. Sometimes they appeared as casual remarks, indirect pressure, or public statements designed to provoke a response. Accepting a challenge often meant stepping into someone else's expectations, where reputation mattered more than growth or understanding. Bruce Lee was fully aware of this climate. He understood that not every challenge was an honest invitation to exchange knowledge. Many were driven by ego, insecurity, or the desire for attention. He recognized that responding to every provocation would trap him in a cycle of endless demonstrations, each one demanding more proof than the last. This was not the path he wanted to follow. Living under constant scrutiny also required emotional discipline. Every action, word, or decision could be interpreted in ways beyond his control. Silence could be mistaken for weakness, while action could be twisted into arrogance. Bruce Lee learned that navigating this environment required more than physical ability. It required judgment, patience, and a clear sense of purpose. He chose to focus on his development rather than on public approval. Training, teaching, and refining his understanding of movement and awareness mattered more to him than satisfying the expectations of others. This focus helped him remain grounded while the noise around him grew louder. In such a climate, refusing a challenge was never a simple decision. It carried consequences, misunderstandings, and criticism. Yet Bruce Lee understood that preserving his direction was more important than responding to every external demand. He knew that real growth happens quietly, often away from public attention, and that not every moment requires a performance. This environment shaped how Bruce Lee viewed confrontation. He learned to separate meaningful challenges from empty ones, and to recognize when engagement would lead to insight and when it would lead only to distraction. The climate around him was intense, demanding, and often unforgiving, but it also strengthened his ability to choose wisely. The challenge that reached Bruce Lee was unusual not because it was aggressive, but because of how it was presented. It was not delivered in a direct or formal way, yet it was visible enough to be noticed by others. This made it difficult to ignore without drawing attention, and easy to misinterpret by those watching from the outside. The lack of clarity was intentional, as it allowed people to project their own expectations onto the situation. On the surface, the challenge appeared to be about skill and ability. It suggested an opportunity to demonstrate effectiveness and settle doubts. However, it did not clearly define what would be gained from such an exchange. There was no shared goal, no clear structure, and no intention of learning from one another. Instead, The challenge relied on public reaction and anticipation, which added pressure without offering purpose. The way the challenge was framed placed Bruce Lee in a difficult position. Accepting it would immediately shift the focus away from his work and toward public judgment. The outcome would be measured not by understanding or improvement, but by opinion and rumor. In this kind of situation, even success can become a trap, as it invites further demands for proof and repeated confrontation. Beneath the surface, the challenge carried an unspoken demand for validation. It was less about discovering truth and more about satisfying curiosity and reinforcing status. Responding would have required Bruce Lee to justify himself, as if his years of training, teaching, and experience were not already meaningful. This expectation reflected a deeper issue within the culture around him, where recognition was often tied to visible dominance rather than personal growth. Another important aspect of the challenge was timing. It arrived at a moment when Bruce Lee was focused on refining his ideas and developing his understanding of movement and awareness. Accepting the challenge would have interrupted that process and redirected his energy towards something external and temporary. He understood that attention, once given, can be difficult to reclaim. The challenge also lacked mutual respect. True challenges invite exchange, learning, and shared effort. This one offered none of those elements. It created a one-sided expectation that Bruce Lee would perform, while others observed and judged. Such a situation reduces meaningful practice into spectacle and transforms discipline into entertainment. Bruce Lee recognized that accepting this challenge would not lead to insight or progress. It would only confirm the expectations of those who believed that ability must always be displayed publicly. He saw that the challenge was driven by ego rather than curiosity, and by comparison rather than understanding. In this sense, the challenge was less about testing limits and more about enforcing conformity. It asked him to step into a role defined by others, rather than continue shaping his own path. Bruce Lee understood that agreeing to such terms would quietly surrender control over his direction. By examining the nature of the challenge, it becomes clear why it demanded careful consideration. It carried pressure without purpose, visibility without clarity, and expectation without respect. For someone deeply committed to growth and self-understanding, responding to such a challenge would have offered little in return. When the challenge surfaced, Bruce Lee did not respond right away. This absence of reaction was noticeable, especially in an environment where immediate answers were often expected. Instead of rushing to defend his reputation or prove his ability, he chose to step back and observe the situation carefully. This decision reflected a level of patience that many people found difficult to understand. Bruce Lee believed that every situation carries a deeper intention beneath its surface. Rather than focusing on the words of the challenge, he paid attention to the motives behind it. He listened to how others spoke about it, how it was framed, and what emotions surrounded it. This helped him see that the challenge was fueled more by anticipation and comparison than by a genuine desire to learn or exchange knowledge. His silence was not a sign of uncertainty or fear. It was a conscious pause, one that allowed space for clarity to emerge. Bruce Lee understood that reacting too quickly often means reacting emotionally, and emotional reactions can pull a person away from their true purpose. By remaining silent, he kept control over his response and avoided being guided by external pressure. Reflection played an important role in this moment. Bruce Lee carefully considered what would happen if he accepted the challenge. He examined whether it would contribute to his growth, deepen his understanding, or improve his work. Each answer pointed in the same direction. Engaging would only lead to temporary satisfaction for observers and continued demands for proof, without offering anything meaningful in return. He also recognized a familiar pattern. Responding to one challenge often leads to another, creating an endless cycle where attention is constantly redirected outward. Bruce Lee did not want to live in reaction to others' expectations. He believed that real progress comes from intentional effort, not from defending one's position again and again. Silence, in this context, became a form of discipline. It required restraint, especially when misunderstanding was likely. Bruce Lee accepted that some people would misinterpret his lack of response. However, he valued long-term clarity over short-term approval. He understood that not every moment of silence needs to be filled, and not every question needs an answer. Remaining silent also protected his focus. Bruce Lee was deeply committed to refining his training methods, exploring movement, and teaching his students. Engaging in a public challenge would have pulled his attention away from these priorities. By choosing silence, he preserved the energy needed for meaningful work, rather than spending it on unnecessary confrontation. This decision demonstrated an important principle in Bruce Lee's thinking. He believed that strength is not measured by how often one responds, but by the quality of the responses one chooses to make. Silence, when intentional, can be more powerful than action because it denies ego-driven situations the attention they seek. In choosing not to respond, Bruce Lee showed that wisdom sometimes lies in restraint. He allowed the situation to pass without adding fuel to it, trusting that his actions over time would speak louder than any single response. His silence was not empty. It was thoughtful, deliberate, and grounded in self-awareness. Bruce Lee believed that energy was one of the most valuable resources a person possesses. He understood that physical strength, mental focus, and emotional clarity are not unlimited, and that wasting them on the wrong situations can slowly pull someone away from their true purpose. Because of this belief, he was careful about where he invested his attention and effort. Accepting the challenge would have shifted his focus away from the work that mattered most to him. At that time, Bruce Lee was deeply committed to refining his understanding of movement, efficiency, and awareness. He was developing ideas that required patience, concentration, and uninterrupted practice. A public challenge would have disrupted that process by pulling his attention toward performance rather than progress. There was also the matter of public spectacle. Once a challenge becomes public, it no longer belongs to the individuals involved. It becomes something shaped by opinion, rumor, and expectation. Bruce Lee understood that stepping into such a situation would place his actions under constant judgment, where meaning could easily be lost and reduced to entertainment. He had no interest in turning his life's work into a display designed to satisfy others. More importantly, accepting the challenge would have allowed someone else to set the terms of his actions. Bruce Lee valued independence in thought and movement. He believed that growth comes from choosing one's own direction, not from reacting to external demands. Responding to the challenge would have meant allowing another person's ego, timing, and intentions to influence his decisions. He recognized that once control is surrendered in one moment, it becomes easier to lose it again. One accepted challenge often leads to another, creating a pattern where a person is constantly responding instead of leading. Bruce Lee refused to fall into this cycle. He wanted his actions to come from purpose, not pressure. There was also a deeper personal stake involved. Bruce Lee's identity was not tied to winning confrontations or proving superiority. His sense of self came from continuous learning and self-expression. Allowing himself to be pulled into a situation driven by comparison would have slowly reshaped how he viewed himself and his work. He understood that protecting his mindset was just as important as protecting his body. By refusing the challenge, Bruce Lee preserved his autonomy. He remained free to train, teach, and evolve on his own terms. This decision reinforced his belief that strength lies in choice, not reaction. It allowed him to stay aligned with his priorities rather than being distracted by temporary validation. Understanding what was at stake made the decision clear. It was not about avoiding difficulty, but about choosing what deserved his energy. Bruce Lee knew that real mastery requires focus and discipline, and that saying no is sometimes the most powerful way to say yes to what truly matters. When Bruce Lee chose not to respond to the challenge, the reaction around him was immediate and varied. Many people were surprised, not because silence was unusual, but because it contradicted what they expected from someone with his reputation. In a culture that valued visible proof and public displays of ability, refusal felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Some observers interpreted his decision as avoidance. To them, strength was something that needed to be demonstrated clearly and decisively. They believed that declining a challenge meant stepping back from confrontation, and stepping back was often mistaken for weakness. These individuals were conditioned to see action as confidence and silence as doubt, and Bruce Lee's choice challenged that assumption directly. Others felt unsettled not because they judged him, but because they could not easily explain his behavior. The lack of a clear statement or public justification left room for speculation. People filled that silence with their own interpretations, projecting fears, expectations, and beliefs onto the situation. In the absence of explanation, uncertainty grew, and uncertainty often makes people uncomfortable. There were also those who felt disappointed. They expected a moment of spectacle, something dramatic that would confirm what they already believed about Bruce Lee's abilities. When that moment never came, they were left without the confirmation they sought. This reaction revealed how often people look outward for validation instead of paying attention to consistent effort and long-term discipline. Not everyone misunderstood his decision. Those who knew Bruce Lee personally, or who had spent time observing his approach to training and life, recognized something different. They saw his refusal not as retreat, but as restraint. They understood that discipline sometimes requires holding back, even when action would be easier or more satisfying in the short term. These individuals recognized that Bruce Lee's strength had never depended on public approval. His confidence came from daily practice, thoughtful reflection, and continuous learning. Because of this, he did not need a single moment to define him. His refusal reflected an inner stability that did not rely on external confirmation. The reaction of others also exposed a deeper cultural belief. Many people assumed that power must always be visible to be real. If strength could not be seen, measured, or compared, it was often dismissed. Bruce Lee's silence quietly challenged this idea. By refusing to engage, he demonstrated that strength can exist without display, and confidence can remain intact without confrontation. For some, this realization was uncomfortable. It forced them to question long-held beliefs about dominance, reputation, and success. If someone as capable as Bruce Lee could choose silence without losing his sense of self, then perhaps strength was not as simple as winning or proving superiority. This idea unsettled those who relied heavily on comparison to define their worth. There were also subtle shifts in how people spoke about him afterward. Conversations changed tone. Instead of focusing solely on what he could do, some began to ask why he made the choices he did. His refusal encouraged reflection, even among those who initially criticized him. In this way, his silence created space for deeper thinking. Bruce Lee did not attempt to correct misunderstandings or defend his choice. He accepted that people would react according to their own perspectives. This acceptance demonstrated emotional maturity. He understood that trying to control others' opinions often leads to frustration and distraction. Allowing reactions to exist without resistance was another form of discipline. The intensity of the reaction faded. What remained was a quiet shift in perception. Those who continued to observe Bruce Lee noticed that his focus never wavered. He continued to train, teach, and refine his understanding without interruption. His consistency spoke louder than any single response could have. The reaction of others revealed more about them than about Bruce Lee. It showed how deeply people depend on outward demonstrations to feel secure, and how uncomfortable silence can be when it refuses to conform to expectation. In contrast, Bruce Lee's refusal stood as a reminder that inner strength does not require explanation. By choosing restraint in the face of judgment, he showed that discipline is not passive. It is an active commitment to clarity, purpose, and self-respect. His refusal quietly reshaped the conversation around strength, not through argument, but through example. Bruce Lee often spoke about mastery not as something loud or dramatic, but as something quiet and deeply rooted. For him, true mastery was not only about what a person could do, but also about what they chose not to do. This belief shaped how he approached conflict, training, and life itself. The moment he refused the challenge reflected this understanding more clearly than any physical demonstration ever could. Bruce Lee understood that engagement always carries a cost. Every action requires energy, attention, and emotional investment. While action can sometimes be necessary, unnecessary engagement often leads to distraction and imbalance. He believed that mastery involves recognizing when action will lead to growth and when it will only create noise. This ability to distinguish between the two is what separates reaction from intention. Restraint, in Bruce Lee's view, was not passive or weak. It required awareness, discipline, and confidence. It is easy to react, especially when pride is challenged or expectations are placed upon you. It is far more difficult to remain still, especially when silence may be misunderstood. Bruce Lee chose restraint because he trusted his own direction more than he feared judgment. Silence, in this context, became a form of communication. By not responding, he made it clear that the challenge did not align with his purpose. He did not argue, explain, or defend himself. Instead, he allowed his silence to express clarity. This kind of silence is not empty. It is deliberate and grounded in self-awareness. Bruce Lee also believed that confidence does not need constant affirmation. When a person truly understands their ability and values, they do not feel compelled to prove themselves repeatedly. Seeking validation can become a trap, pulling attention outward and creating dependence on approval. Bruce Lee refused to let his sense of self be shaped by external demands. This moment highlighted the difference between ego and confidence. Ego demands recognition and reacts quickly to perceived threats. Confidence remains steady, even when questioned. By refusing the challenge, Bruce Lee demonstrated confidence rooted in preparation, discipline, and inner balance. He did not need a public moment to confirm what he already knew through years of practice. Another important lesson in this moment is the idea of choice. Bruce Lee believed that freedom comes from the ability to choose one's response rather than being controlled by circumstances. Refusing the challenge allowed him to remain free. He continued to move forward on his own path instead of being pulled into someone else's expectations. This principle applies far beyond martial arts. In everyday life, people are often confronted with situations that demand reaction, explanation, or defense. Not all of these situations deserve engagement. Bruce Lee's choice reminds us that saying no can be an act of self-respect, and that silence can protect focus and clarity. The deeper lesson is not about avoiding difficulty, but about choosing meaning. Bruce Lee did not avoid hard work or challenge. He avoided distraction. He knew that mastery requires sustained attention, and that scattered energy weakens progress. By refusing the challenge, he reinforced his commitment to growth rather than display. This approach shaped how he lived and taught. His students learned that strength is not measured by confrontation, but by control. They learned that wisdom often appears in restraint, and that true power lies in alignment between action and purpose. Bruce Lee's refusal serves as a reminder that mastery is an internal process. It does not rely on applause or recognition. It grows quietly through discipline, reflection, and intentional choice. This moment, though simple on the surface, carries a lasting lesson about self-mastery and inner strength. The challenge itself was temporary, but the lesson endured. Bruce Lee showed that knowing when not to engage is just as important as knowing how to act. His silence was not absent. It was understanding, and through that understanding, he demonstrated a form of mastery that continues to inspire long after the moment passed. The challenge that was placed before Bruce Lee eventually faded, as most challenges do. Time moved on, attention shifted, and the noise surrounding that moment slowly disappeared. What remained was not the challenge itself, but the meaning behind his response. By choosing silence, Bruce Lee showed that strength does not always announce itself, and confidence does not require an audience. This moment invites us to reconsider how we measure power in our own lives. We are often taught to respond quickly, to explain ourselves, and to defend our position at every opportunity. Yet Bruce Lee's choice reminds us that restraint can protect clarity, and that walking away can preserve direction. Silence, when chosen with awareness, is not surrender. It is self-control. Bruce Lee did not refuse the challenge to avoid conflict, but to remain aligned with what mattered most to him. He understood that real mastery is built quietly, through consistency and intention, not through public moments of validation. His decision encourages us to ask a simple question before engaging with any challenge. Does this move us forward, or does it only demand our attention? The lesson is not about martial arts or reputation. It is about choice. It is about recognizing when action serves growth and when it serves ego. Bruce Lee's refusal stands as a reminder that the strongest response is sometimes the one we never give, and that true power often reveals itself in calm, deliberate silence.